I'm going to take a slightly different tack, and I'll begin with the point that historically there's no such thing as pure democracy. There are historical forms of democracy, and we'll just map out the major historical forms. There are many variations within them. If we begin with human societies, we can identify what should be called baseline democracy. This is characteristic in particular in tribal societies and early human forms, and included all adult participants, men and women, in deliberations over what would happen in a particular group, relationships with other groups, and so on. Engels did a lot of research on this in the 1770s and 80s, and there's been substantial research done on that since. Now, that particular form of baseline democracy arises from the socioeconomic realities of tribal societies. A second historical form we can identify is ancient Greek democracy, which was practiced in a few city-states in Greece with small populations. We have to call this slaveholder democracy. Why? Because the only people permitted to participate in the assemblies were adult males who owned at least one slave. That meant that the vast majority of people in the much vaunted ancient Greek democracy, that includes slaves, women, foreigners, etc., were excluded from the process. So it's democracy for a minority. And of course, this arises from the particular slave system, slave economy that was the reality in ancient Greece. Now, there is a third type in history. Now, in Western scholarship, this is not usually mentioned, but it is an element of Chinese scholarship on the history of democracy, and this is feudal democracy. We can, if you like, speak of a kind of feudal democracy among the aristocracy or among the nobility, in the sense that there was a reasonably highly developed sense of individuality and interaction between the nobility, and they would typically enable all sorts of deals, sit on advisory panels for the monarch, and so on. Historically, and the one we've been talking about more is the one that arose perhaps 200 years ago in Europe, and that's capitalist democracy. They like to call it liberal democracy, but as Carlos Martinez pointed out recently, that's because they don't actually want to call it capitalist democracy. There are many, many features we've already discussed. I would like to highlight three features of it. The first one, it boils down usually to the expression of the people's will, if you like, in terms of elections. Now, these happen periodically, 2, 3, 4 years. In some countries, they're more frequent, such as in Switzerland, over policy things. But it's actually a very thin notion of democracy. It's restricted to elections. The second feature is that it's a highly antagonistic form of democracy. And we see this all the time, where the political parties are more interested in scoring political points against each other. Everything is politicized, and you find efforts to bring down the opponent by whatever means possible, whatever scandal, gossip, or whatever can be brought forward. The best example of this is the atrocious effort to try and deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. You see this, the worst situation in the United States of America or in England and so on. And why? Well, because health, which should obviously and simply be a concern for the well-being of health of everybody, becomes a political football that's tossed back and forth and so on. And this is even the case here, obviously in Denmark, where where I am currently, is constantly politicized, and measures go up and down and so on and so forth. And of course, it's obvious that the politicized nature, or as Marx and Engels called it, the political character, is based on class and class conflict. The third feature that some of us have already mentioned is the obvious fragmentation and decline of capitalist democracy. This has been apparent, particularly since it was believed in the Western countries that they had achieved the pinnacle of human civilization due to a 40 or even 50-year decline in Western capitalist countries. And so the manifestation of this is in all sorts of ways. The prevalence of conspiracy theories, the narrative of the anti-vaxxers, social unrest, chronic lack of trust in governance and government institutions. It sits around the 40 to 45% mark in capitalist countries. Clearly, fragmentation and decline. And the fifth type I'll mention briefly is, of course, socialist democracy, which is our focus here. This already has a history of development in different contexts in light of specific conditions for 100 years or more, from the Soviet Union through to the present day. We find it manifested in what has recently been called in China the whole process people's democracy, the integration of a whole series of components, electoral democracy, but also very much integrated and dialectically related consultative democracy and its important subgroup, grassroots democracy. And you also have, as has been mentioned, the crucial role of the leadership of the Communist Party in socialist democracies. Now, for Westerners, this one is particularly difficult to understand. How can you have leadership of the Communist Party when you have a democracy? Well, I mean, maybe a beginning is stop thinking in either or categories and think in both and categories. So socialist democracy is enhanced by the leadership of the Communist Party, and the leadership of the Communist Party is enhanced through socialist democracy. And then there is the crucial role, of course, and closely tied with this, with the role of rule of law, socialist rule of law, ruling the country according to law. So there's 5 integrated components in this whole process: electoral, consultative, grassroots, leadership of the Communist Party, and rule of law. Now, I said at the beginning, there's no pure form of democracy, but if we go back to the basic sense of the term, Greek demokratia, minju in Chinese, it means the rule of the people. The people are masters of the country. So there are historically better forms of democracy, and it's becoming clear, more clear, with the examples we've heard today in many other ways, from Venezuela, from Vietnam, also from China, and so on, that socialist democracy is a superior form of democracy. And the simple reason is that socialism is far more democratic than capitalism. Thank you.